We've been reporting at length these clashes between the democracy protesters and security forces in Hong Kong. There have been anti-government protests continuing, though, in another region of the world, the Middle East. Let's go live to Lydia Khalil from the Lowy Institute on the protests in Iraq. Lydia, thanks so much for your time. And there's been a deadly bomb in Baghdad, which has been the hub of these anti-government protests in recent weeks. Can you give us an update of where things are at?
Well, thanks for having me. As you said, there have been protests ongoing in Iraq since about early October. These were largely self-mobilized mass movement protests led by young people in Iraq, as we've seen in many parts of the world, including Hong Kong, as you mentioned, but also in Chile. So we're seeing this as part of a big trend of protests around the world. But in Iraq specifically, these have been the largest protests since the 2003 Second Gulf War. They were held in response to a great dissatisfaction, not just among the youth, but among people in general, with the current Iraqi government, but also previous ones instead. The protesters have demonstrated against corruption that they view as endemic within the Iraqi political system, the basic lack of services, the lack of employment opportunities, basically the same thing that we've been hearing over and over again with regards to mass protest movements around the world.
And we've seen these clashes between demonstrators and security forces, and as I mentioned now, at least 2 people killed in a blast in the Iraqi capital, 3 others killed in clashes with the security forces. So violence, we've seen the violence here in other protests, not the clashes haven't been as severe like in Lebanon, but no less concern there about issues like corruption, for example.
That's right. The violence at these protests is extremely concerning. Analysts, the United Nations, human rights organizations have been highly critical of the Iraqi government response to these, what started out as largely peaceful protest movements. A lot of the violence is coming either from the Iraqi security forces themselves or pro-government militias, or in fact Iranian-backed individuals and militias who people fear are interfering in these protests. So the violence is indeed concerning. But there is an interesting dynamic with the protest movements in Iraq. You see some parts of the protests where violence is occurring. We've had the bomb blast, as you said, a heavy-handed response by the security services and other affiliated groups. But in areas like Tahrir Square in Baghdad, there's a more festive atmosphere around the protests, with they're largely peaceful. The government forces are trying to quarantine the protesters within this very small area, perhaps limiting them just to the Tahrir Square area in order to perhaps show that they're not as widespread as they actually are. So there's a strange kind of dichotomy between what's happening in Iraq right now. On one hand, you are seeing many deaths and injuries and violence in certain parts, but then also a very open, festive atmosphere in certain areas. You know, the Iraqi government response to this is going to be very important in terms of not only how it deals with how these protests resolve, but also address the underlying issues that the protesters are demanding that the Iraqi government address, which is corruption, political reform, and a restoration of more and better services to the country.
They've been, as we've reported on you can see at the bottom of the screen, there are 300 people killed since those protests began. So we're not talking about a small number here. And the embattled Prime Minister, he says that the government will investigate the deaths, but the protesters wouldn't have much hope of any outcome there.
There's a severe lack of confidence with regard to the people, to their government, again, because of this very long history of corruption that the political class in Iraq has engaged in. The Iraqi government has, promised reform in the past and has not delivered. You're seeing a situation in Iraq right now where the corruption of the political class is really coming to a fore. You have a current account surplus, $68 billion in oil revenue. The funds are available in order to provide services and to restore Iraq to a more representative and equitable distribution of services. At the same time, so much of these resources are being siphoned off by a political class that the protesters are highlighting. They're tired of the sectarian nature of the way that the political divisions and the political structures in Iraq are playing out. And more importantly, to add to legitimacy to the protesters' demand, we have Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who is a preeminent religious authority and moral authority to Iraq, recently coming out and legitimizing the demands of the protesters and calling on the Iraqi government to do more to address the demands of the Iraqi people. So the fact that they have someone like Ayatollah Sistani on their side, legitimizing their demands, is a very significant thing for the protests and shows that their concerns are legitimate.